We have three practitioners of a dark art, the carbon markets. These are very much in the news these days, but in fact, there's nothing new about the idea of having markets for trading carbon. We can go back several decades to the Kyoto Protocol, which envisioned these. We saw environmental trade going back to the trading of SO2 or sulfur dioxide, acid rain pollution was in the Clean Air Act amendments of 1992 in the United States. What is perhaps the most successful environmental policy in American history involves environmental markets and trading, which is that SO2 trading program. So these are not new ideas, and at The Economist, we have long advocated a role for trading and economic tools, market-based instruments, in dealing with climate change. However, here we stand today in 2023 with hardly a week or two going by without some kind of challenging headline suggesting that there's a problem in carbon markets, whether it's scandals or whether it's lack of trust or whether it's corporate ambivalence or whether it's another expose. There seems to be a problem. This is not the first time the plane has failed to take off and achieve 30,000 feet in altitude. And so to help us figure out how do we realize the clear and theoretical potential of carbon markets to be able to provide those transfer of resources, to be able to accelerate in the most efficient way tackling of climate change, of delivering carbon benefits that we so urgently need, I want to ask our experts here. I might start with Robin. Robin, your company, Verra, is very much at the heart of some of the discussions today. Can you give us your perspective? You're in the hot seat here. Anyone who follows the news will know your company and will know that you're in the midst of grappling with some of these challenges yourselves. Bring us up to speed. Tell us, what do you think are the real challenges we need to overcome, and what are you doing to overcome them?
Thank you very much, Vijay, and thank you very much for that introduction. You're absolutely right. Carbon markets are the world's foremost tool for channeling finance towards emission reduction and removal projects around the world, as well as sort of providing all sorts of development benefits for communities. What we're really seeing in Verra right now, of course, is, and Verra, I should take a step back for those of you who aren't aware, we've issued around 70% of carbon credits in the voluntary carbon market, around 1.2 billion credits, 2,000 projects around the world. What we are seeing, though, is that despite that size, despite that growth, everything that we've done, everything the voluntary carbon market has done, really is still a pilot project. We are still in a learning by doing phase. We are at the cusp of many cutting-edge innovations to these, such that it's really a question of sort of really repairing the plane as we're flying it, and that's what we're seeing right now. I'd like to sort of spend a little bit of time here as what I see as sort of the key things that are confronting carbon markets right now. One of them is a crisis of supply, and the other is a crisis of demand. On demand, I think my colleagues are really better placed to see this. We do see there is significant under-demand out there. Governments haven't set the policy frameworks for ambitious enough targets yet. Corporates are shy and so forth, but colleagues will go into that. What I'd like to talk about right now, though, is really one of supply. Supply is one of the thing that consumes us the most, and what we're working on right now is a set of different areas in which we're seeking to bring high-quality supply to market. One of that is reforming our project cycle. This is still an analog creation for a digital age, and so the use of greater technology, digitizing the project cycle, that's sort of foremost among that. The second is that, as we see, I mean, by definition, carbon markets, as sectors decarbonize, the proposition, that additionality proposition, becomes less viable. We need to look constantly towards new sectors. What's cutting edge? CCUS, blue carbon, biochar. These are the areas that we're looking at next, provide sort of that source of supply, and we have a lot of methodology work that's going on there. Another area really is one of integration with governments. Governments are coming online. What does that look like? How does the voluntary carbon market integrate and feed into those? And finally is one of registry systems. The Verra registry is a trading platform. It is one that we are continuously seeking to improve. We recognize that investors, large-scale ones, need to have, there are certain controls, certain expectations that they have, and we're looking to sort of meet those needs. that's sort of a snapshot of what we're doing, Vijay. Happy to go into that a bit more.
Yeah, let's spend a moment on this. I liked how you sort of delineated challenges in supply, and we'll come to the demand. Of course, the two are linked. If you had infinite supply of highly reliable credits, I'm sure people would be banging down the door to buy it, at least if it were at a reasonable price. And so maybe the problem is more on the supply side, I would put to you. There is concern about biologically based sources of credit. Bill Gates famously, or at least infamously, perhaps, during Climate Week in New York at UN Climate Week, I was there with him when he said the following: "Are we the science people or are we the idiots?" In talking about investing in trees for carbon credits, is in his view that's a terrible investment. That's Bill Gates. He's entitled to his view. But there are some questions about integrity of the quality of credits and the kinds of credits. You did allude to CCUS and other forms of credits that may have geological timeframes. You did talk about advanced mineralization or direct air capture, but perhaps those are others that people talk about, engineered solutions that have a different kind of carbon credits. But this question of quality of credits, really to step back. Is it a problem that these are project-based and therefore every project is going to be unique and hard to verify, fiddly and expensive, that transaction costs involved and the lack of transparency that there is in trying to figure out every single project meets specs is different from other commodity markets, right? Take oil. We're in the Middle East, of course. This is a great oil power here in UAE. Yes, there are great differences between WTI and Brent, or Venezuelan heavy and Maya heavy and some of the lighter grades. But fundamentally, a barrel of oil is a barrel of oil. It's a fungible global commodity that's connected in a global marketplace with reasonable metrics and some variations that can be worked out. And they're traded here as in other places in the world. Can we get to a point in carbon markets where the supply side can trade with the slightly proximate fungibility that we do with oil? Or is your instinct that we'll never get there, that's the wrong mental model? Maybe that's the wrong thing we're working on.
I mean, I think that's a really good question, and one, frankly, that I think the market itself is very much split on. This is a market with such transparency. It is a market where you can go into any carbon credit and you can track down not just the country, you can not just track down the type, but you know which project it was, the vintage year, and everything like that. And that's, as you say, it really makes it really different from a lot of other commodities. In terms of whether or not that is the better model versus one where there's sort of an obfuscation of those underlying qualities, I think it's an open question. I think perhaps what we will see is that market evolving to meet both needs. And I think that it's not maybe an either or, but I think there will always be interest in sort of what we might call charismatic projects or projects that have certain characteristics. But I think that as well, we are going to probably see on, as we move towards more jurisdictional approaches and so forth, especially in the nature-based area, I think we'll probably see a little bit, almost by nature, standardization in that area. So.
Well, that's interesting. So standardization is something you're putting on the table. We'll pick up on that when we come to our next speakers. Maybe we can turn to our next speaker. Let me ask you, what your perspective? You have been handed the job of talking about demand, but I'll give you the freedom to talk about supply if you want to comment on what we've already heard thus far.
Well, I think what Robin's saying, you really need to understand that the process of taking a carbon credit from beginning to end involves many stakeholders. It's an incredibly transparent process, arduous, and there really is no sleight of hand when it comes to projects at Vera. So there is no big sort of conspiracy. There are methodologies that haven't traveled well. There are projects where the stakeholders on the ground have done things that obviously fell through the cracks, and Vera is fixing all of those things. But I think that you asked the question in terms of what is it that's necessary in order to make carbon fungible, right? You compared it to.
Or indeed, can we?
And my answer is that it absolutely can, but it's not in the hands of Vera and it's not in the hands of the marketplace. It's actually in the hands of governments, right? Because today, if you look at the market, the ultimate buyer of carbon credits are corporates, And when a corporate buys a carbon credit, they also buy reputational risk, right? And there is nothing they can do to shed that risk that they've taken on with that transaction unless they are buying a carbon credit that's stipulated by their government. So if the governments tell their companies, these are the carbon credits that you should buy, then it's the government that's taking on the mantle of reputational risk, not the corporate. And this has happened before. It works perfectly well. During the first Kyoto era, when the European Emission Trading Scheme came out, there was a linking directive that stipulated what carbon credits from the CDM era could be traded in the EU ETS. Mm-hmm. And it was a rush to find the carbon credits that most efficiently priced so that the corporates could deliver them into the tax system. That's what's needed in order to scale these markets. If we sort of try and push that responsibility to the corporates, what you get is inaction, because it's literally impossible for them to isolate themselves from that risk.
It's as you rightly say, it's the wrong place to put that kind of due diligence efforts.
Absolutely.
Asking every company on earth to have a dedicated team to vet every possible carbon credit is ridiculous. Now, a company like Microsoft or Amazon, we know Stripe and Frontier, there's some buyers coalitions that have invested huge resources and have world-class experts doing nothing but looking at advanced blue ocean sequestration or weathering projects. Good for them. And Microsoft can spend €1,000 a ton, which is what they did, to buy carbon credits in Iceland from a pilot project. It's sort of a first mover, like the people that bought the first Tesla, let's say, they overpaid, maybe did a bit of virtue signaling, or maybe they're helping buy down the market. Huzzah, we're happy they're doing that. But that's not a scalable model for everybody. And certainly the 1,000 or million companies that come after Microsoft and Amazon and Stripe cannot afford to have teams internally doing that kind of vetting. Your suggestion is that it should be government, or at least regulation of the sort we saw in Europe. I think Singapore might also come in on this.
Yep.
There are others that would say maybe third parties, maybe auditors, third-party vetting could be a solution in some markets. We see in commodity markets. But I'm curious, would that satisfy you if it were not a compliance market regulated intrusively by government, but instead having some other form of vetting? Do you see that as a possibility?
I just think that if you leave any wiggle room, you don't eliminate the reputational risk. So it is squarely on the shoulders of government.
Okay. Your position is very clear. Yes, let's turn to our final speaker. Thanks for your patience, Chris.
I think for those of you in the audience thinking about investing in this market or what the opportunity is, I think it's really important to keep in mind what's being criticised about the market and what isn't. What's not being criticised is that projects failed, or that trees that were paid for weren't planted, or forests that were supposed to be protected weren't. Those things are observable at low cost in real time. We're having an argument about the carbon additionality, the carbon accounting frameworks of those particular projects, not whether those projects worked. And Vijay, you used the word ridiculous. I think this whole conversation is ridiculous for a couple of reasons. If you think about the demand side or the need side in the market, to get to stay on track for 1.5 degrees, we've got to reduce emissions by 75 times more in the next 2,000 days than we've been able to do in human history. It's a colossal investment opportunity and a colossal challenge. And so what we have to be thinking about is not whether there's 30 million tonnes. If you add up all the carbon credits in the world that are subject to some criticism of overclaiming, you can offset global emissions for 6 hours. It's a non-issue. What is an issue is the 99.5% of emissions that are not being offset at all. And so we really need to focus on how we get more corporate participation in the offsetting. Bill mentioned confidence and regulation. I actually think it's much simpler than that. At the moment, companies risk getting in trouble if they use carbon offsets. We need to move to a position where companies get in trouble if they don't. And there are a number of integrity initiatives underway that are making that true. And when that corporate demand comes to the market because of those higher integrity standards, There is no way we are going to be able to meet that demand with supply as we know it. If there are just the Science Based Targets Initiative, 30 billion tonnes a year of emissions. If you add up every single carbon project in existence and every single carbon project in the pipeline, you get maximum supply of 1 billion tonnes a year. Something's got to give.
Let me push back on you a little bit, Rich. The idea that we need much more in terms of offsets, that we should flip the script, as it were, or the narrative. There are those who would argue, and I think many of them will be arriving in Dubai on very carbon-intensive jet flights from around the world shortly.
I flew in on one of those.
Right, exactly. They weren't on the Virgin flight that had sustainable aviation fuel that landed in New York a couple of days ago. They would say, actually, the offsets themselves are a problem. You're having debates about quality of offsets and transparency and fungibility. That's an argument about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. We should not use offsets at all or use them minimally, but rather we should actually reduce emissions. Offsets are a bit like an indulgence, a papal indulgence from the centuries past. We should actually minimize them, and this is partly where the science-based SBTI, Science-Based Transparency Initiative, and so on, take this view that you should do the deep cuts at home, do them first, not use any at all if you can, or if you must, use only so-called high-quality offsets, and we can have a big debate about what's high quality, what's not. It sounds like you, at least the way you framed your conversation, it was the opposite. I just want to poke at you with that.
That is completely backwards.
Tell me, explain why. Why are those people wrong?
The fundamental principle should be, if you pollute, you pay. Every tonne, every time. This is an emergency, and you do not get to emit 1 tonne of CO2 without paying a price for that tonne, in my view. And so what we need to get to the point is absolutely yes. You do not get to use carbon offsets instead of decarbonising.
I see.
You have to use those as well. And so if we followed the Science Based Targets Initiative guidance, the company who has residual emissions left over after they've decarbonised what they can do internally doesn't have to start paying a price for their pollution until 2050. So go and tell that to the communities in Africa that they need to wait 27 years before a big company will decide to invest outside their own business in a global climate emergency. We have to do everything everywhere all at once, decarbonising internally and offsetting externally.
What do you think about this question, Robin? If I can ask you to step in here about the role of offsets.
So, I mean, I agree with Rich at heart. Fundamentally, the issue is that not enough emissions around the world are covered by pricing, whether that's government set or whether it's through corporate normative forces that sort of drive corporate behavior. And this is a real issue. I mean, the fundamental problem is that the atmosphere is agnostic about emissions. Don't get me wrong, we absolutely have to sort of be committing, I think, every one of us to reducing own emissions first, and that does have to come first. But the question of residual emissions that remain, this is something that I think everyone should be taking an active interest in, and it's something that people should be looking to sort of fully neutralize. And I do feel a little bit that we've lost our way a little bit. I think, as Rich points out quite well, that if the balance, sort of excluding too much of a role for offsetting and for neutralizing what remains, I think that can get us in trouble and results in missed opportunities, not just for the climate, but for development as well.
This raises one question in my mind. I mean, the idea of paying for pollution is music to my ears, right? We have long advocated at The Economist externalities pricing. Carbon is external to the market, right? It's an externality in the nerdy talk of economists. And so some form of carbon pricing, carbon tax would be ideal, economy-wide, globally harmonized. But absent that, other ways of getting at the polluter pays principle is absolutely the right first principle. We've been banging the drum for a very long time. I think I wrote my first leader more than 20 years ago in The Economist arguing this. I was treated as something of a pariah at dinner parties. But now, almost a quarter, approximately, of the world's economic activity is covered by some kind of carbon price. Now, often it's an insultingly low price, but it's a signal. It's a start. It can be ratcheted up over time. China is a big chunk of that at a very low price, but nevertheless, the trend line is going in the right direction. If we were to get to a world where we have 100% of economic activity somehow miraculously covered by a meaningful greenhouse gas price, we can say CO2 equivalent price, because there are other greenhouse gases of note, methane, for example, will be a topic of attention in COP this year. If we get that pricing, why do I need offsets? Why do you make me pay twice?
That is a great question, and a carbon tax, controversial statement coming up, a carbon tax is less effective as a climate tool than a carbon market. And the reason for that is a carbon tax is still just a theory of change. The theory says if there's a tax, a company will be motivated to change its behaviour to avoid the tax. What a carbon credit is 1 tonne of proven climate impact. So in order for the carbon tax to be true, 2 things have to happen. One is the company has to change its behaviour, and then the tax that's collected has to then go to be used to reduce emissions, because by definition the company hasn't reduced emissions itself. In a carbon market, that impact has already been proven and is being funded in arrears. And so you jump over that step of having to collect the money, and then the government goes and finds a project to invest in. The project's already been done and proven.
And I would add that what the carbon markets also do is they bring market efficiencies, right? So basically you have capitalistic motivation to go and find where can I reduce 1 ton of carbon the most efficiently. And then once that is satisfied, then you go to the next project and the next project and so forth. So there is no more efficient way or ecosystem to reduce a ton of carbon than through the carbon markets.
Go ahead. And I would just add, a tax does not guarantee an outcome. We can get into questions of elasticity and so forth, but simply making something more expensive, sure, might influence behavior, but it can't guarantee it. Whereas a market is all about quantifying impacts and that direct correspondence between pollution and impact. And I think that's a lot more powerful in many ways than a tax.
So you make a good conceptual argument. The proof in the pudding is if you can develop a carbon market that actually has integrity, right? That is what you say. This is a credit. It really represents a ton of carbon removed. We can prove it. It's bulletproof, transparent. The problem is we haven't been able to get there, right? It's been 25 years since Kyoto.
We've gotten to, it's your point, right? The whole integrity question is centered around a handful of projects, right? The famous sort of Guardian article is in fact sort of guilty of doing exactly what they claim the projects that they mention do, which is cherry pick your studies, right? They cherry picked certain studies and then they painted the entire market in a certain color. If you look at the market as a whole, there's a significant amount of integrity, significant amount of good projects out there.
Let's talk about efforts to build trust, because short of government regulation, which is not going to happen in the short term, although it may in individual countries like parts of Europe and Singapore we talked about, there are efforts that are Mark Carney and other poobahs of the global climate leadership world are working on bringing together some transparency, some commonly agreed rules, standards, benchmarks. Does one of you want to take that? Talk about which of those initiatives is looking most promising and what might be more we need to see on that front.
I'll have a go, and then I'm sure Robin and Bill will as well. The different initiatives serve different functions. So the Science Based Targets Initiative is trying to hold companies to account for setting and meeting a goal that is consistent with 1.5 degrees of warming. And then in order to do that, companies are going to need some level of carbon offsetting. And the demand side of carbon offsetting integrity is managed by an entity called the VCMI, the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, who for the first time this week came out and said it is okay to use carbon credits to meet part of a science-based target for Scope 3 emissions, which is by far the biggest category of emissions, the emissions from lighting stuff on fire. And then on the supply side, it's the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, which makes sure that projects like the ones that are issued by Robin's organisation, Vera, meet a very high standard. So it's not, I don't think that which one of those will succeed. I think they'll all succeed, but they're providing different functions into the ecosystem.
What do you think, Robin?
Yeah, I mean, we're the ICVCM is as Rich said, the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets. We see that absolutely as something that will help to bring a greater consistency, confidence, and trust. It is an initiative that at first we had some questions about, but one which through work and cooperation we've gotten very comfortable with. We put in just recently our submission to the ICVCM to have our program submitted for assessment, as well as various categories of different project types. We're very confident, and we're looking forward to seeing how that work goes on. Otherwise, we are strong supporters of VCMI and frankly any other initiatives that are out there trying to sort of increase integrity, confidence, and scale.
Any thought on this? I mean, could we head toward, let me put it to you more pointedly, are we headed to a world like US GAAP, let's say, is for accounting rules, and international GAAP, where might be just one or two systems that are broadly agreed accounting principles?
Or
you think it's going to be a hodgepodge?
I just see VCMI and ICVCM and anybody else as data points. They are not sufficient to scale the markets. They provide guidelines. They provide, show us where the goalposts are, but they don't eliminate the reputational risks that I talked about initially. So, very valiant efforts. They've really taken on a big bite of the apple, but I just don't think they're enough to scale the voluntary carbon markets.
But they might be stepping stones in the right direction.
They are absolutely a
which is what they seem to be.
And crucial.
Yeah. I have 1 minute left, so I'm going to give one of you the chance to put forward a big idea to our audience on what we need for demand to come back to this market in a big way. At the moment, the word is that we've had a bit of a retreat because of some of the concerns expressed. Yeah. What would you like to see in the next 12 months to bring it back? I think an understanding, actually, demand is not in retreat. 50% more companies this year have offset their emissions than did last year. And this market has grown by 400% since the Paris Agreement was signed. So it's growing, it's just not growing fast enough. And I think what I would like people in this room to understand is there are billions and billions and billions of dollars being invested, all with the same thesis. The price of carbon has to rise by multiples if we're going to solve climate change. We agree. So buy the carbon and just do it in a way that, as we said before, has the integrity of the ICVCM and the VCMI. This is the biggest investment thematic of the next 30 years. And so we need these integrity initiatives. But for us, we think it's Abu Dhabi 5 Minutes Week after all, a highly compelling opportunity for all of you. All right, well, you get the last word. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Please give them a nice round of applause for taking the tough questions.